Good afternoon, Dr. Larkin. I'm glad to greet you at the marathon dedicated to memory study. To start with, can you tell about yourself and your scientific activity?
Well, I am working as a director of the Applied Neuroscience Institute, and I'm working presently on what I call the crystallization of knowing and being, which is really about the phases or the ways in which reasoning unfolds in greater complexity, the evolution of the brain and the evolution of complex reasoning.
Dr. Larkin, you mentioned a word, crystallization. Could you tell what the crystallization is?
Well, crystallization is a term or a metaphor that describes something that is perhaps developmental, but more than developmental. And that is that we gain a particular kind of clarity 3 or 4 different times in our lives, or 3 or 4 different times in the unfolding evolution of the brain. And because of longevity, because we live longer, these stages or these crystallizations actually have more of an opportunity of appearing in their distinctiveness. They crystallize. Actually, they are crystallizing the reality that happens around us and within us as a way of knowing and being in the world. And that way of knowing and being changes 3 or 4 times if we will allow ourselves to move through the transitions that are really the difficult part of the unfolding of complex reasoning.
Dr. Larkin, which memory models do you consider the most applicable in practice?
I don't consider that any particular one is absolutely applicable, probably a little bit from each of them. I think that we don't understand memory nearly well enough that any one system covers the range of what we think memory is and what we think memory does.
In your opinion, what definition of memory?
I would say, from my work, that memory is not necessarily autobiographical. It's not necessarily for the purpose of storing just the past for the sake of memories, that it really is much more about the interpretation of the present knowing and being that we have. But even more so, memory is about what is preparing us for the future. It's the nature in which the way in which the brain, the way in which evolution uses what we have experienced to prepare us for the future, rather than to sink us or to cause us to stay in the past. Memory isn't about the past, it's really about the future.
Dr. Larkin, one more question. The past and the future are connected, and if memory connected with past, does it mean that it is connected with future too?
Well, the past certainly does fuel our future, but we're going to see that past, this past of ours, in a very sorted, censored, edited version of that past. The past we remember or recall is not necessarily true, is not necessarily accurate or biographical. We will remember that past in relationship to how we carry it in our heads and then how we carry it in our brains, and we're going to remember that as well in terms of how we are interpreting the present. It's going to serve us in making sense of the present, and then it's going to serve us in getting our brains ready for adaptation, for movement forward into more complex stages of reasoning. Where we reason in any one given time is always attempting change and always moving forward. Every night that you sleep, interneuronal connections that are no longer necessary are washed away by the toxins provided from the fear we arouse from our nightmares. There's got to be enough acetylcholine, there's got to be enough fear-driven chemical activity in the brain at night. We're getting enough sleep that we're always pairing and changing and cutting away interneuronal connections that are no longer useful. What that cutting away serves is a movement forward into a greater complexity of the way we reason for the sake of the evolving brain.
Dr. Larkin, could you share about your research and 3 periods that you described in your book?
Let's take a more basic example of what crystallization might look like or feel like in everyday life. Let's go to what I believe is the last major transition that we make. That is a change in reasoning. Let's go to probably the 4th one, and that's the movement from being a success and making one's own personal life worthwhile and building a significant life, becoming a success, an achiever, a winner. We have moved on from the last crystallization, which is the importance of community and relationship and marriage and family, and crossed a transition that puts us in this needing to achieve this sort of personal arena of accomplishment. And as we are busy in this career or job or fulfilling this life that we've put before us so that we can maybe perhaps make a pile of money or have some power or leave a legacy behind us, what we are doing, the job we're doing, the activities that we're involved in, perhaps the marriage that we're involved in, all of those things during the crystallizing of that way of knowing self and other has worked very well. The person has accomplished and achieved, and then one day you realize that I'm going through the motions of something that used to give me a lot of meaning. I'm going through the activities of marriage, and I'm going through the activities of this job, and as a matter of fact, I'm not as content as I used to be. I don't so much believe in, do I really believe in, how much do I believe in what I'm doing? How much do I believe in this God that I worship or this church that I go to? How much do I believe in this marriage that I'm in? How satisfying is this relationship of my marriage? And it's as though one begins to think about the ways in which I'm making significance or thought I would make meaning out of my past really aren't making the meaning, or the crystallizing that was there. It isn't so crystallized anymore that I really like this job. It isn't so crystallized anymore that I really like my life right now. I used to like it. I used to really be very, very devoted and very empowered by what I've done, but it's not so empowering anymore. It begins to feel like the ground underneath me, what I stand on, is this memory of the past brought into the present, that the way I have remembered it to be and the way I am allowing it to be known is kind of going shake, shake, shake. We just had an earthquake here just before this this interview, by the way. 4.3 earthquake. And that's kind of like what this is like. We call it brainquake. We call the transition a brainquake. It's sort of like something starts to shake and to rumble underneath us, and we start to begin to wonder, is the way in which I'm the world is crystallized for me, is the way in which I'm knowing and being in the world making sense? And it doesn't seem at a point of transition to be making the same sense it did before, meaning the same thing, giving enough satisfaction. And we begin to have this sort of uneasy unrest where we can become anxious or depressed or think that mental illness is starting in. We don't fit into this old crystal as well. We don't fit into this way in which we have known and been in the world, and we probably don't talk to anyone about it because they would think we were crazy or that it would worry them or concern them. So we continue to play the role, we continue to be the way we were in this crystal, and then we begin to realize we're not at all satisfied. It increases, the rumble increases, the discontent increases, maybe into something we call depression, which is really not depression, it's just the fact that we're losing something, we're losing a hold on something. And it's maybe as though there's something way off in the distance, but it's so gray and so cloudy and so far removed that whatever it is we're after just seems way far away from where we are. And that's kind of the beginning of one area of crystallization, where we've been very happy begins to break down because a new kind of adaptation to a more complex reasoning is calling to us. The brain is trying to unfold into more complex reasoning, and we feel that shake in the solidity of the crystallization at that point. And because the brain is going to move on, and it's going to evolve if we let it, or not if we decide to stubbornly stay where we are in terms of the way we see things and make things be, and we make it work, and we make ourselves probably ill in the process, when in fact there's a transition going on, and that transition involves the very roots of the way in which we remember. We will start to remember our past, what we call our past, because memory isn't just for the past, but we'll start to remember it through another emerging lens or another emerging crystallization. And that feels like walking through very choppy, uncertain, muddy water to get to wherever we're going and not really be sure of where we're going. But all the time, evolution is pushing us, moving us to think more broadly, to think more expansively, to think more clearly about who we are and how we are interpreting memory, but as well how that memory, our interpretation of that memory, is allowing our inherent values to emerge. Crystallizing and memory are really for the purpose of, evolution is for the purpose of aligning us more with these inherent values that are within us, that have been peeking out through each of the crystallizations, and now have an opportunity to emerge in with much more clarity than they have emerged in the past. Or we can stop that process and resist it and say, no, I'm not going to learn. No, I'm not going to let go of what isn't giving me satisfaction. I'm not going to let go. I'm going to pretend that it does. I'm going to pretend that everything is fine, and I'm going to retire and get fat and happy and eat everything I want, and just deny that there's a real earthquake that could go on inside of me. I might want to leave my marriage. I might want to leave my faith. I might want to leave my education. I might want to just change everything so radically that I can't even look at it or I can't even consider it. Is really the biggest. And what that last transition is going to do is to cut through the nature of our associations with what we remember. It's going to cut through the nature of our object relations. It's going to cut through the emotional hold we remember that we have, but actually may not have, in a way that's true and real for us.
Dr. Larkin, how do you think all people in the world pass through these three phases?
I think that in adult life, there is the potential for all people of the world to go through similar like crystallizations. And I think one of the things that we're seeing now in the world is an enormous period of an enormous time of transition, where we are attempting to go back to maintaining nationalism, when in fact we have one world, just evidenced by the fact that we're talking like we are this morning. So instantly, all of a sudden I'm with you folks halfway around the world in an instant. And that is altering the sense of our belonging. It's altering the sense of how we define ourselves and who we are, from nationalism really to what I call this last crystallization, which is the emergence of a new world citizen, a new world statesperson, that we begin to, where the world is in this transition of having to see ourselves differently in order to sustain, in order to adapt and sustain in such a way the planet on which we live.
Dr. Larkin, you just have told about person who lives two lives. He can likes and doesn't like the way he lives simultaneously. Does it look like split personality or schizophrenia?
Yes, exactly. It looks like a psychological illness. It can look like that. And I think a lot of psychological illness that we label as anxiety or depression or bipolar or schizophrenia, a lot of these things that we label as mental illness are in fact just this kind of separation that you talk about, this separation between one way of knowing and being competing with an emerging, evolving way of knowing and being between, say, two crystals, and that memory, interestingly enough, comes in to both help us, but it comes in to hamper us in terms of the way we want to use memory. The brain is able to store 4 or 5 different versions of a memory. For example, all through the night, we are, especially through the night, but I think in the daytime as well, we are sorting the data of the previous day. And if, for example, I have pretended to be something I'm not with you, memory is going to store that happening. It's going to store it in terms of how I presented myself. It's going to store it in terms of what the truth is, what I believe the truth is, even though I may be hidden from my own truth. It's going to store it in terms of the version I told it to, who did I tell it to, store it in many different ways, so that at some point, if we ever want to take a look at what really happened, we can go back and say, well, what really happened? Maybe there's enough of that memory for us to be able to tell what really happened, maybe not, but the memory can store very different versions of the same thing, because we present ourselves in terms of, say, this pretend, this divided person that we are. I'm going to pretend that everything's okay, and then we are the person who knows that everything is not okay. And the more we do that kind of dividing, the more we open the potential for standing on less firm ground and less firm, say, sense-making of the world. And when it begins to fall apart, when the memories don't fit together, when we can't make sense out of it, then we see some of the really difficult transitions that we see, and it appears as both mental illness, I think, and it appears as physical illness. Another way to look at it is that if we're refusing to evolve, if we're refusing to reason in the complex ways that we're being led to, then natural selection is going to select us out, and it will use the natural processes of psychological or physical disorder to do it.
Dr. Larkin, we know another phenomenon as people that lost their memory. How do you think in which phase they can lost memory, how person loses his memory and where does the memory go?
Well, fugue or amnesia is a very possible reaction to not wanting to or not being able to put together the way we have seen things before and the way we are being called to see them as the future unfolds for us. I may not want to look at what a mess my relationship with my spouse is, and I may want to pretend that it's it's bearable and it's what I have and it's what I'm going to live with and what I'm going to get along with. And when someone begins to ask questions about that or begins to create a situation where that conflict has to be confronted, fugue or amnesia can be a reaction to two ways of looking at things, or two crystallizations combating each other, refusing to unfold. And certainly that's one of the ways. We are able to compartmentalize, and we're able to deny, we're able to use basic defenses to a point where we no longer have access to those memories. We forget. One of the most common things that we work with when we're helping people through these transitions in crystallization is that people forget over and over again some of the things that we talk about, some of the things that we do. They just lose their memory about it. So it's not as though some people do it, all of us do it. We do this kind of forgetting about what it is that we don't want to have to confront or deal with or think about. And we can forget whole pieces and parts of our lives, but they are sometimes reconnected or brought back to life sensorily by a smell, by some experience that sort of knocks loose the defenses that we have to memorizing it or to remembering it. One of the things I've been interested in studying lately is this chemical called DTM, where people are going to Brazil and to retreat houses to take this liquid drink that enables them to sort of look at their whole past in one view. And it's a chemical way of taking down this defensive structure that can cause us to want to forget and experience their whole life flies in front of them, and they're able to see how they've pretended and how they have faked it and how they've been a fraud over and against the choices that they should have made to be who they really are. Actually, what that is this attempt to realign us in each crystallization, to realign us in a different way and in a more clear way with our values, with what our valuing is. We're kind of always being asked, what are your values? What do you value? And each stage of crystallization is expressing a new way of our valuing. But if our valuing is strongly divided between faking it and pretending, pretense, what we call the life of the saboteur, and no connection with the real self, with the real valuing self, then we begin to see the problems emerge that refuse to move into more complex reasoning. And we get slogans in this country like, let's keep America great again, make America great again. The issue isn't making America great again. The issue is realizing we are citizens of the world, that we belong to a much larger reality. And we can certainly forget that and be amnesic about it and not want to work on pollution or climate change and pretend it doesn't exist as amnesically as any single person is not facing reality.
Dr. Larkin, how do you think? Do such scientists as neurobiology, neuropsychology, and others describe the memory issue in full today?
Well, I don't think anybody's got the memory issue in full today. I think the memory issue is confused because we don't really understand what it's for. We don't understand its nature. And we're beginning to adjust to the fact that we do all kinds of things with memory. And we particularly see this in sleep. If I look at sleep charts, I can tell how aligned you are with your values. I can tell in a sleep chart what is the degree to which, not the degree to which, but what is the nature of that alignment to values, or how far are you away from those values. And in seeing that, I'm able to tell where you are in your crystallization, in your clarity, because essentially we're after a kind of basic issue here, and that is, what are you valuing? And how do your choices and your behavior match that value? And how much of what you think you value is what you really value, are your essential values. We're finding the answers to those questions through all of these crystallizations. And memory is subject to, memory is being utilized by all of that. Memory, the brain's kind of put it there, but it puts it there, say in our sleep, and it tells us when we look at a sleep report, that tells us how much crystallization is going on, or how much transition may be happening, or may be predicted. Does that answer your question?
Dr. Larkin, do I understand correctly that everything that is around us, everything that we can use, all of this is memory?
Yes, it is all a part of memory. We are certainly influenced culturally. We're influenced most basically by our family system. And that family system then feeds into the culture, and the culture begins to give us some information, lead us in how we should process those memories, how we should see what we call memory. And we are always dealing with that family system and that culture over and against what our own personal, real values are, what our authentic values are. And very often, the family system and the culture alter the authenticity of those values. They tell us to use this value in this way. The value can be contorted, it can be changed, it can be deranged by the time it expresses in behavior. So most certainly our culture and family systems are influencing the way or the nature in which we remember. Evolution and the process of crystallization is leading us to a more accurate memory, if you will, to a more accurate interpretation of how true is the way we remember, how authentic is the way I am remembering who I am over and against who I authentically and essentially am in terms of my own individual value. And those are kinds of the poles that we work with in our lives that express in our sleep and express in our wakefulness in terms of this issue, and that is, what am I valuing? What are my choices? And how consistent are my choices with my values, and how consistent are my experienced values, what I think my values are, with my really authentic essential values. We can change those values. We can so contort and so derange our values that they look very different from what they essentially are. We can shape-shift our values to adjust to what the culture or family system or our own misinformation to ourselves requires. Mm-hmm. But we're essentially being led back to that connection to the most basic connection we have, so that we can connect with our real selves rather than connect with a self that is separate from and other than our values.
Dr. Larkin, many scientists think that the center of memory is brain. How do you think, and how can we verify this fact?
Well, I think that you can make memory as vast as you want to, but the brain is the brain, and it's happening in the brain. The brain is influenced by the sensors in the gut, and the brain is influenced by the sensors in the stomach, and the brain is influenced by culture on the outside of us. It's influenced by our representation of self and other, the way in which I see other, how clearly I see myself is going to determine how clearly I see the other. All of those things function as a part of memory, but as far as I'm concerned, the brain is the brain. And if you shut the lights out in the brain, all those other lights are going to go out as well. There is, as far as I'm concerned, no gut brain. There is no stomach brain. There is a brain that has sensors in various places and various collections that we pick up a whole lot of information from things that are around us. But the computer we're working with is the brain we have, and it's certainly connected, I think, to a larger oneness of mind, but we are not very much in touch with that, I think, until we get into when we more take down this idea of the self we have, the self we've constructed and maintained by memory. When that goes down and we are more in touch with the valuing that plugs us into a greater universality, we can maybe talk about more about a larger mind, but the brain is the brain. I think that the memory is stored in the brain. Whatever memory is stored in the brain. If we want to move into a discussion of the one mind, or of consciousness, or of ways of being that are transcendent of the individual, then we move into this arena of metaphysics and mind and brain, and that's one of the reasons why I chose the term crystallization, is to keep the process more focused on what is happening in the individual person's brain, in relationship certainly to all of these other sources, but that it's crystallizing, it is clarity, coming to a greater and greater clarity, and that what we call memory is serving that purpose.
Dr. Larkin, thank you very much for your interview and for your time.